Hi. Welcome to our special coverage from World Economic Forum at Davos. I have a very special guest with me. I have Managing Director of World Economic Forum, Saadia Zahidi, with me. Saadia, thank you so much for joining us at Times Network. Yeah, and it's great being here. I think the excitement is at its peak as World Economic Forum kicks off. And, as we have heard that this is the largest ever forum with 65 heads of state attending and more than 1800 corporate representatives. So lots of exciting stuff, but I want to discuss with you a couple of key burning issues, as far as global economy is concerned. I'll start with jobs and AI because, one of the stark number which is floating around, which I have also seen, is that almost 22 to 24% jobs are likely to change by 2030. That's almost here. So that's, what is your reaction to that?
Yeah. So actually, it's a number that we put out over this last year through our Future of Jobs report. So that's essentially a quarter of all jobs that will go through some kind of churn. And it's a net positive, right? So we're expecting that there will be more jobs than less. But at the same time, it's a big churn as a large number of jobs get displaced and a large number of jobs get created. Now, there isn't a one-to-one match between those that will lose their jobs and those that can move into those new jobs. That's going to require a massive amount of reskilling and retraining. And again, it won't be a one-to-one match. There will be a need for moving people who will lose some of their current roles into adjacent roles, and there will be a need to massively bring talent into the new roles that will be created in this sort of broader new economy. Now, what is that new economy? It's certainly not just technology and artificial intelligence. It's also stemming from geoeconomic changes and what that is doing to jobs. It's stemming from the energy transition and the broad shift towards sustainability and green. That's also leading to a whole new set of skills. And then, of course, there's some changes that are coming because of demographics. For countries that are aging, require much more healthcare than they did before. Countries that are growing require much more education than they did before. So those are the four big factors that are leading to shifts in the future of jobs.
Right. Saadia, the fear is that probably the governments across the world are maybe not necessarily on top of the entire situation. So nobody has a full handle on the entire gamut of things which are at play. And especially when it comes to AI, to some extent, everybody is trying to guesstimate that where exactly what kind of impact will happen, which is slightly unnerving. What's your take on that?
So we've tried to suggest that the only way to navigate through this uncertainty is to use some scenario thinking. And we put out something recently to try to demonstrate that, and we're working with business leaders here this week on it. So let's take two very simple vectors. One being how quickly artificial intelligence is integrated into the economy, and the other being how quickly people get reskilled, upskilled, and retrained. Now, that leads to four possible scenarios. One scenario in which we have this sort of supercharged progress. AI gets integrated, we get the productivity gains, and people are able to catch up. It also leads to a scenario in which maybe AI doesn't move so quickly, but actually people get retrained and reskilled, and that leads to some kind of a co-pilot economy where essentially people are in the lead. You could also end up in a scenario in which people don't catch up and it's really artificial intelligence that's integrated, and there we're talking about mass displacement. And then finally we could end up in a situation where we don't really get any of the gains that we wanted, either from artificial intelligence or from investment in people. So if you use that scenario thinking and walk backwards to today, what's the one no regret move that all governments could make? And that is massive investment in human capital, building out the kind of skilling systems that most governments simply haven't had, right? So there is a focus on primary or secondary education, there's a focus on higher education, but there's very little thinking about how do you do lifelong learning. And that requires multiple things. That certainly requires a common language around skills and jobs taxonomies, because every employer and person need to be able to talk from the same language. That also requires a very different kind of certifications, for example. And I think that's where more progress will need to be made. Countries such as Singapore have done well on that front. Countries such as the Nordics do well on that front. And now some of the developments in India as well. And in fact, we're partnering with the Indian government on a skills accelerator to do exactly this.
In fact, I wanted to ask about India. obviously there is a very strong belief that India has a demographic advantage, and I mean, we also in fact add one more layer of democratic dividend to how India is evolving. But every year millions of people enter workforce. Do you think India is doing enough to upskill them, skill them, and tackle the emerging scenario thanks to AI and geoeconomics?
So I think demographics is an opportunity, but it's not a guaranteed destiny. And I think that is where much more focus needs to go into actually preparing people. Now, as I mentioned, in India, I think that is really starting to happen, this recognition that for this massive economy to live up to its full potential, it needs to ensure that then all the people within it need to live up to their full potential. And with the massive workforce of young people that's coming into the economy every month, every year, that will require a lot more focus on skilling and training. And India has some, of course, very bright spots when it comes to the growth that it's seen in its ICT industry over the last years. But here's an opportunity to now, for example, couple up technology with agriculture and turn, for example, agriculture into a much more higher value add sector. Similarly with healthcare, similarly with education. So there's a lot that can be done in a domestic economy that leverages the demographics quite differently.
Right. Saadia, I want to bring in the concept of globalization. It is going through a sea change. In fact, the whole thing is turning upside down right now. And we are seeing that nations are far more comfortable dealing with other nations bilaterally rather than looking at a global platform or global scenario. In that kind of an environment, the benefits of a globalized economy and growth become that much more difficult or challenging. How does an emerging economy like India deal with that? Because India was heavily dependent on, I mean, if I have to give an example, let's say H1B. Now suddenly, there's this whole concern about how it will play out going forward.
Yeah. So I'll point to two things. One is the problem, which is that geoeconomic confrontation is the number one risk in our latest global risk report that we just launched a few days ago. Following very closely interstate armed conflict. So overall, people are worried about geoeconomics and geopolitics, but when you dig a little deeper, what they're specifically worried about is, yes, tariffs, but also investment screening, control of critical resources, talent mobility, as you just pointed out. So there's definitely all of that concern. But the second element is, for most developing economies, it is extremely clear that economic cooperation has been a pathway to growth. And it has brought benefits for the last 30 years to their populations. So there isn't that same impetus for economic nationalism that we've seen in some of the advanced economies, and that is exactly why you're seeing this rise in bilateral trade agreements. In fact, we asked our chief economist community, we said to them, what is their prediction for how economic cooperation will play out? And over 93% of them believe that we're going to see a massive rise in bilateral and minilateral trade agreements, and that is a reflection of a continued desire for most of the world to continue economic cooperation. And I think that is a very good thing, including for jobs.
Right. But are you slightly concerned as a global body about what's happening between large economies? So you have a slightly subtle but a situation between, let's say, US and China. The US-India agreement is still in the making and nobody knows how much time it will take. And now you have a sort of an emerging, I would say, fault line between US and European Union. I mean, that obviously doesn't play out well for world economy.
Yeah, it's a very complex picture. I mean, certainly it is one of the most complex backdrops that we've had to an annual meeting at the World Economic Forum. I think there's a few different elements of this, because I see both glass half full and glass half empty, if you will. So the global economy has been far more resilient than anyone predicted over the course of 2025, right? So we're entering 2026 with much higher growth rates than we thought would be happening. If we look at certainly the IMF and World Bank data, but in addition to that, we asked our chief economists looking out over the next year, what are they expecting to see happen? And they're still expecting relatively high, moderate or relatively high growth, certainly in India. It's the number one region that they're most excited about in terms of growth prospects. They're seeing relatively high growth play out in East Asia. They're seeing relatively high growth in the MENA region. So again, a lot of the global south is to some extent, going into 2026 relatively insulated. But there is the flip side of this, which is, have we just seen short-term resilience? And are we now going to start to see tariffs biting people? Are we going to start to see companies and producers and importers passing on some of those price effects to the consumer? What is that going to do to inflation? What is that going to do to inequality? So I think the risk is very much there, and I don't want to downplay it. But we are entering 2026 more resilient than we thought things would be, in part because much of the rest of the world has continued to recognize the importance of economic cooperation.
So can you say that 2026 will be better than 2025, because 2025 turned out to be better than expected?
Well, I think as we've all seen over this last year, we shouldn't be in the business of predictions, but what we can try to do is, again, use some scenario thinking. And here we're going to be doing this in a big session with some of the business leaders that are gathered here, to try to see what does it look like in a more geoeconomically confrontational versus more geoeconomically cooperative world, versus a second vector, which is a more technologically accelerated world and a more technologically deaccelerated world. So I won't get into all the details here, but we believe that the best way to get into this current situation and looking at 2026 is to not just look at predictions, but to actually look at possible scenarios, and then to work backwards and actually take some, clear decisions. Which scenario do we want to be in? And for all of us to try to use our agency and some of this cooperative muscle that we're trying to build here in Davos to actually try to pull people closer together and return to some level of focus on growth and prosperity and ensuring that people are delivering what their populations need.
Right. You mentioned about Global South, countries like India, the emerging large economies, they will require, and I think most of Global South will require, a massive amount of job creation. In your sense, what are those jobs going to be, or what are the kind of skills which will be required for those countries to sustain their growth momentum, because it has direct impact on global growth?
So we've been looking also at the skills front, because it's very easy to say invest in human capital, but invest in human capital towards what? And so we try to unpack what that means. And there's one element which is human skills, and let me break that down: collaboration, creativity, being able to work with others, analytical thinking, creative thinking. All of that rises to the very top when we ask business leaders what types of skills they're looking for. Second element is technology-related skills. So basic digital technology use, but in addition to that, there is a desire for much stronger AI and technically focused skills, but application of AI, right? So this is not just about very basic use of ChatGPT. This is about being able to integrate that to actually get to the productivity gains in various sectors, whether it's healthcare or education or financial services. A third element is sustainability skills. These are actually still incredibly high on the agenda for most of the business leaders that we're connected to. Some of the largest multinationals that are represented here, they are still looking for sustainability skills. But again, it goes beyond a general sense of green and sustainability. It's about being able to apply that across different sectors, whether that is the solar sector or whether that is a professional services firm that needs somebody who understands sustainability. Fourth area is business skills. So it's incredible how many young people can come out of a college or university education and not have a basic sense of business-related skills. So here we're actually going to be launching an effort with universities and businesses to try to get them into a sort of a much stronger partnership and cooperation that has less to do with more traditional academics and simply putting very practical business skills in the hands of young people. And then finally, there's a fifth element, which is you need more sort of vocational skills, right? So traditionally, especially in developing economies, vocational training and trades have tended to be very low-skilled professions and certainly very low-wage professions. But now if you combine that with the more sophisticated machinery that is available and combine that with the more sophisticated artificial intelligence sensing technology that's available and actually convert those trades into something that is much more of a sort of a higher certification profession than it has been in the past, again, that creates massive opportunity. So those those are the 5 sets of new economy skills that we've found to be incredibly important. And I'm probably giving you a much longer answer than you want, but that piece is where that investment needs to go. And then there's the other piece, which is that governments need to develop much stronger labor market information systems. So they need to apply the same kind of data build out and dynamic data creation that they do to lots of economic indicators. They need to be able to do the same to labor market indicators, because to your point, it's a complex picture. It's going to change with every new trade agreement. It's going to change with new technologies being integrated. So governments need to design a much stronger system that monitors multiple sectors to be able to be agile and support people in making job transitions.
Right. One quick last question, Saadia, before we wrap up. Which is the biggest risk in the near future for global economy? Is it geopolitics? Is it AI? Is it trade war?
So it's a combination, but number one, geoeconomic confrontation. That's what 18% of our respondents are worried about, and they're worried about it even 2 years out, followed very quickly by geopolitical confrontation, so interstate armed conflict. Further down the list, we see concerns about economic downturn, inflation, asset bubbles bursting, particularly the very high valuations of AI companies and what that might do in the longer term. And then further down the list, in the short term, is the environment. But when you look out at 10 years, that's still the number one risk for the top 3 places in the 10-year outlook. So I think we can't forget that these are all deeply interconnected risks. And maybe just last point there, the most interconnected risks, so the risk that has the highest impact on everything else and in turn is affected by everything else, inequality. That's the piece that I think is going to be kind of make or break in terms of whether societies remain functional when they face these geoeconomic pressures, when they face these technology pressures and economic pressures, and when they face environmental pressures.
Absolutely. Well, that was good. Thank you so much, Saadia, for joining us, and all the best for World Economic Forum.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.